Today, some women so take for granted the right to vote that sometimes they don't even bother to go to the polls. Yet, as recently as 100 years ago, we didn't have that right. You could hear,
"Granting women the vote will ruin the nation's morals.
It will lead to the destruction of the family.
Bring socialism.
It's a sin against God.
Women will lose their feminine virtues and respectability.
Good women do not want to vote.
Woman suffrage will reopen the Negro suffrage question.
ladies, please. Many of the women working for suffrage had already made names for themselves in the temperance movement. Therefore, most makers and distributors of liquor automatically were against votes for women. But the idea of an equal voice for women was not new in the 20th century.
In Pilgrim times, Anne Hutchinson learned from Native American women that women had the right to vote in their society. The real issue to those in power was that Anne dared to overstep her place as a woman, and they feared that she would likewise inspire other women to rebel. In March 1638, Hutchinson was excommunicated and banished from the Massachusetts colony. In New York, she and her family, with the exception of one daughter, were killed in an Indian attack.
Women performed crucial tasks in the American Revolution, organizing fundraising drives, supplying the troops, working in the military camps, and tending to the wounded soldiers. Some women even acted as spies, and there is at least one documented case of a woman disguising herself as a man to fight in the war.
After the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act, the Daughters of Liberty was formed. In 1765, women who sought to demonstrate their loyalty to the revolutionary cause boycotted British goods and instead made their own. Martha Washington, wife of George Washington, was one of the most prominent Daughters of Liberty.
In 1777, Abigail Adams wrote her husband John at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia to remember the ladies and all they had done to help win the Revolutionary War.
In particular, Quaker women, who had a right to voice their opinions in their church, sought the same freedom in political affairs. In 1776, the state of New Jersey adopted a constitution letting all qualified persons, regardless of gender, vote. Not many did so.
However, in 1808, some New Jersey women went to the polls to vote for Thomas Jefferson.
Sadly, some men accused them of going home, changing clothes, and returning to vote again.
That New Jersey election was set aside as illegal.
And the men in power quickly rewrote the law to restrict voting to
free white males 21 years of age or older.
A century would pass before the women of New Jersey could vote in national elections. By the mid-1800s, the movement to gain voting rights had spread across the nation.
Harriet Forten Purvis, an African-American abolitionist and suffragist, founded the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. She fought against segregation and for the right for blacks to vote after the Civil War. Harriet joined the National Women's Suffrage Association, founded in 1869 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
In 1840, the Constitution of the Kingdom of Hawaii granted universal adult suffrage, the first sovereign nation to do so. But the right of women to vote was specifically rescinded in the second Constitution of 1852.
Former First Lady Dolly Madison and Betsy Hamilton, widow of Alexander Hamilton, attended the laying of the Washington Monument cornerstone on July 4, 1848. They looked at each other and agreed, Our only hope is the young man from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln.
2 weeks later, on July 19th and 20th, the first Women's Rights Convention was held at Seneca Falls, New York. Lucretia Mott and female Quakers local to the area, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, organized the meeting comprised of 6 sessions, including a lecture on law, a humorous presentation, and multiple discussions about the role of women in society.
One of the women selected the Declaration of Independence as a model for their Declaration of Sentiments. They wanted to make that at the convention. Stanton changed a few words of the Declaration of Independence to make it appropriate for a statement by women, adding the phrase, "and women," to make all men and women are created equal.
The Declarations of Sentiments was signed by 100 individuals, 62 women and 38 men. As a comparison, there were 56 signatures on the Declaration of Independence, all men. The passage of the suffrage resolution started 72 years of organized struggle for women's suffrage.
In 1851, Akron, Ohio, Black woman Sojourner Truth rose to speak. She inspired everyone with her "Ain't I a Woman" speech, demonstrating that women were not too soft and fragile to bear the responsibilities of full citizenship.
A woman ran for political office nearly 50 years before women got the vote. In 1871 and the following year, the Equal Rights Party nominated Victoria Woodhull, who was backed by Cornelius Vanderbilt, for President of the United States.
After the Civil War, many women's clubs were formed. The YWCA was formed to aid young girls who, working in factories, were away from home for the first time. The Grange, a large farmers' organization, gave equal status to women from its inception. In 1885, it officially endorsed women's suffrage. The American Association of University Women was formed along this time.
Ellen Clark Sargent advocated for women's rights. In 1869, she founded the Nevada County, California Women's Suffrage Organization. Soon afterward, she became president of the California Women's Suffrage Association.
That same year, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton founded the National Women's Suffrage Association to advocate for a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote.
Ellen became its treasurer.
In the presidential election of 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 15 other women voted illegally in Rochester, New York. Anthony was subsequently tried. The judge would not permit Anthony to take the stand in her own defense and eventually directed the jury to issue a guilty verdict.
He sentenced Anthony to pay a $100 fine, which she refused to pay, challenging the judge to hold her in custody or send her to jail. The judge declined, knowing this would allow her to appeal her case to the U.S. Supreme Court. She was convicted of violating the 14th Amendment that had passed 4 years earlier, which stated in part, when the right to vote at any election is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state.
In 1878, Ellen Clark Sargent's husband, Aaron, while a senator from California, proposed a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote, but it was not passed.
But it was in the West where women first gained the real power and right to vote. Pushed by Esther Morris, a 6-foot-tall pioneer woman, Wyoming Territory had granted women the right to vote in territory elections.
Then in 1890, when Wyoming was considering joining the Union, the pioneers, men and women, said they'd remain a territory if giving up the women's vote was required for statehood. Thus, the U.S. Congress, after much debate, let Wyoming enter the Union with women's suffrage, but only for local and state elections.
Reporters took sides, and in 1906, a British reporter used the word suffragette to laugh at those fighting for women's right to vote. The suffix "et" used to refer to something small or diminutive, and the reporter used it to minimalize the work of British suffragists.
In 1910, Mark Twain said, referring to women's sphere in life, "I'll say that woman is always right. For 25 years I've been a woman's rights man. I have always believed, long before my mother died, with her gray hairs and admirable intellect, perhaps she knew as much as I did. Perhaps she knew as much about voting as I."
The battle for women's suffrage was in full force, both in Britain and the United States in the early 1900s. In 1908, Emmeline Pickwick Lawrence designed a suffragist color scheme of purple for loyalty and dignity, white for purity, and green for hope. Conventions of women
And a few brave men.
Were held in a number of states.
Several other states then granted women the vote for local and state elections. In 1887, Susanna Salter was elected the mayor of Argonia, Kansas, the first woman mayor in the country.
In 1892, Laura Eisenhuth of North Dakota was elected superintendent of public instruction, the first woman elected to statewide executive office in any state.
In 1878, what became known as the Susan B. Anthony 19th Amendment to the Constitution, designed to give women the vote in all elections, and named for Susan B. Anthony, was presented to Congress.
And voted down.
2-1.
But the proposal kept coming back.
In 1900, at the age of 74, Ellen Clark Sargent became a tax protester. Her position was simple. Why should she have to pay taxes to a government that wouldn't let her vote? Just like the Boston Tea Party protest over a century earlier.
In 1911, Utah, men proposed an all-woman town council of Kanab as a joke. Given there was no other slate proposed, the women were elected. After successfully running the town for 2 years, men decided to run and put an end to the first all-women town council.
4 years after Jeanette Rankin of Montana was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1916, women won the right to vote nationally with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920.
But it wasn't easy. On June 5, 1916, the National Women's Party, NWP, led by Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, was founded. Members picketed the White House, protesting President Wilson's failure to follow through in his earlier advocacy for women's suffrage.
In 1917, warnings to the protesters turned to 3-day sentences for obstruction, and by August, several women had been arrested multiple times.
And then, on November 14, 1917, 33 suffragists from the National Women's Party were arrested for picketing outside the White House for the right to vote.
Yes, they included Dorothy Day, Dora Lewis, Alice Kusu, Lucy Burns, and Doris Stevens. Those arrested were incarcerated at Virginia's Occoquan workhouse. There, they were tortured and brutalized by the guards.
They were clubbed, beaten, kicked, choked, stripped naked, chained to the bars in a workhouse cell, stabbed with the stick that once carried a protest banner, and force-fed until they became ill.
They were denied immediate medical attention and privacy when using the toilets. They were denied legal counsel.
They dubbed their treatment on November 14, 1917, as a night of terror. Attorney Dudley Field Malone helped galvanize public sentiment and support of the suffrage movement through the word of this night of terror.
Finally, in 1919, the amendment made it through Congress and was ready to be ratified by the states.
But it had to be approved by 36 states.
And that wouldn't happen until 1920.
In the final 10 years before ratification, the women's movement
And its opponents.
ratcheted up their efforts. Women's reaction to the proposed amendment and the suffrage movement was diverse. How did our grandmothers feel about voting? Let's see.
Good gosh, I'm Elvira Jane Moss, and I don't really think my daughters and I are ready to vote.
First of all, please note that I am Miss Maud Fitzgerald, born in 1850. So I celebrate my 70th birthday this year, and I'm proud to say I'm a suffragist.
Well, I'm Sophie Durst, and my husband and I believe women should be able to vote. But I think you suffragists attract the wrong element. Half the men who want to stop you are drunk.
This is confusing.
My father was a strong abolitionist and temperance leader, and I grew up listening to many discussions about the rights of slaves. So, I'm hoping that we include our Negro friends when it comes to voting. Also, understand that the alcoholic beverage companies are the bastion of men and against our right to vote.
I grew up in a small town in southeastern Illinois and have lived there all my life. I'm a wife, mother, and grandmother. In fact, I've buried 2 husbands, but recently I remarried. Because I completed 8th grade, that allowed me to begin teaching when I turned 16.
I'm from Ontario, Canada, where I married John Durst. We moved to Michigan and became U.S. citizens there. We moved to Sunnyvale around 1905, acquired a farm on Mary Avenue, and have been growing fruit.
I'm still confused.
I realized that marriage and the usual feminine domesticity were not for me. I enjoyed my freedom too much to be tied down to running after children, cooking, and cleaning, and indulging the whims of some man.
Well, it was enough for me. John and I have 2 children, 1 daughter and 1 son. I didn't get to college, but I read a lot. I certainly keep busy helping John run our family farm. I think it's important for women to have the vote, and fortunately, John agrees.
Such educated women. Vote, vote, vote. What is all this talk of votes? I'm Hannah Pulaski. My husband, Janusz, and I come here from a village near Krakow, Poland, where we had a dairy farm. In the fatherland, there is no talk of votes for women, or men either.
While at the university, I became very interested in the suffrage movement. I read about the Seneca Falls Women's Right Convention. I followed the fight for votes, often marching, picketing, and was even arrested once. I even went with a group of like-minded women to protest at state capitals in Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, New York, and New Jersey. Naturally, my very proper grandmother Yerkes was appalled at the idea of her granddaughter being jailed. She'd been even more aghast if she'd known how some jailed women were treated. Fortunately, I never was force-fed or put in a straitjacket.
Yes, I heard about an American Quaker named Alice Paul who joined British women in their campaign for suffrage while studying in England. She founded the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage in the U.S. That group demonstrated outside Woodrow Wilson's White House in 1917, culminating in the so-called Night of Terror that November, during which the guards at a Virginia workhouse brutally beat some 30 female picketers. At the time, Paul herself was serving a 7-month stint in prison, where she was force-fed and confined to a psychopathic ward.
In 1918, the British government granted suffrage to all women over the age of 30, ostensibly in recognition of women's contributions to the war effort.
As a teacher, I've always been involved in lots of hometown activities and issues. I've never been timid about speaking up on issues. I feel education and taking care of one's own family is vital. But this issue of women's right to vote has worried and challenged me for some time. Yes, I know about the convention in Seneca Falls. In fact, even had my students read about it.
Me, I never went to school in the old country, but here in America, my children and grandchildren go to school. Father Stanislaus at church, he says we all need to learn to be citizens and study the English language. My children, they help me learn. I want to be a citizen. Janis got a job in the meat packing plant where his cousin was working. Not an easy job. Living in this farming community is very different from that at home in Poland. It's noisy, but better for the children to grow up here.
My brother Arthur goes into Chicago on business each month. Frequently, I join him. As the Rock Island line passes through Chicago, I can look down and see that so many families lack what my friends and I often take for granted. I see undernourished children playing in the streets, women hanging their laundry out of upstairs windows, and the noise and smell of the stockyards. At first, my father didn't quite understand or approve of my activism, but he admired Sojourner Truth. He approved of her fight against slavery. When he saw I was acting on those same values for women, he gradually became a strong supporter of women's rights. He made it financially possible for me to live my life as I felt I needed to.
My new husband owns a lumber yard here in town, and he hears a lot of talk from his male customers about those blankety-blank suffragettes. Well, he hasn't said he doesn't think women should vote. He knows how many responsibilities I already have, and he doesn't think I need any more. I do know what's going on here in town, but I would need my husband's input and direction for much beyond that.
While I think we women should be able to vote, I think some of you suffragists have gone too far. Marches are fine, but padlocking yourselves onto the White House fence and insulting the president just makes many men more negative. I think we women should use the power of the purse and not buy from businesses that won't support women's vote. We should write letters to newspapers and to the men in power. Those of us with sons should educate them to support women's right to vote.
We should try anything that works.
We all know there are subtle ways to get some men to see our position, or at least not oppose us. Every alcohol beverage concern has been loudly opposed to votes for women. My friend in Cupertino, Elizabeth Lowe Watson, holds a meeting at the end of each June under the Temple Oak on her property. She is president of the Northern California Women's Suffrage Association. Elizabeth is a spiritualist and pastor at her church in San Francisco, where she's very influential in the women's suffrage movement.
I'm convinced we'll never improve the lot of women and children unless we have a voice in how things are run. And that means voting for leaders who understand and represent women and family issues.
Things are different here than in the old country. Last week, my grandchildren came home from school and said next week they will vote on class president. Imagine, the school has a president in each class. The children will give speeches. make signs, and study government. Vote. Maybe if it's good for children, it's good for mothers and grandmothers too. I will see.
We suffragists were really excited when Teddy Roosevelt had women's suffrage as part of his 1912 Bull Moose Party platform. But if women in the heartland had been studying the issue, what, if anything, had been happening back in Washington?
When President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Washington on March 3, 1913, for his inauguration, he found the streets deserted.
8,000 of us were over on Pennsylvania Avenue marching in a women's suffrage parade.
I've been pleased to see that Western territories such as Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho made allowing women to vote a condition to becoming part of the Union. Women in California have had the right to vote since 1911, almost a decade before the rest of the country, followed shortly by Washington, Oregon, and Arizona. On January 12, 1915, for the first time in history, the U.S. House actually voted on national women's suffrage.
But it lost 204 to 174.
But many were surprised at how well it did.
Now, women redoubled their efforts, but President Wilson still wasn't ready to act.
Although he had voted for women's suffrage in his own state of New Jersey.
Women picketed the White House, spoke up, were jailed and worse, and petitioned their congressman. But Wilson refused to push the issue until he'd signed the peace treaty in Paris, ending World War I.
While traveling the country to urge ratification of the Versailles Peace Treaty, Wilson suffered tremendous physical strain. On October 2, 1919, Wilson had a serious stroke, leaving him paralyzed on his left side and with only partial vision in the right eye. He was confined to bed for weeks and sequestered from everyone except his wife and his physician.
Anxious to help the president recover, his private secretary, his physician, and the First Lady determined what documents the president read and who was allowed to communicate with him. For her influence in the administration, some have described Edith Wilson as the first female president of the United States.
On Wilson's return from Paris in 1919, with the peace treaty signed, he finally recommended to Congress, at the insistence of his wife, that it pass women's suffrage.
It immediately passed the House, 304 to 89.
But the senators, who always loved to hear themselves argue, took longer.
Finally, they too passed the amendment, 66 to 30.
Now it was on to the states for ratification. 36 states were needed. 22 state governments ratified in 1919, followed by 13 more in 1920.
One more state was needed.
We had watched state after state vote A or nay. The southern states in particular were against it. It came down to Tennessee and the vote of one member, Harry Burns. We all hoped he would listen to his mother, who had written him, "Don't forget to be a good boy, vote for suffrage."
And he did.
Women could now vote in national elections.
And run for all offices, too.
Voting rights for women were introduced into international law by the United Nations Human Rights Commission, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, and adopted in 1948.
And it was a long, hard fight we need to use wisely.
So, whatever else you do each November,
Vote!